In this lesson, we're going to create a piece of geometry that will capture the reflections of our environment as well as help us cut out for our compositing phase. So here's where we left off. I've just opened up 07 begin, and so we need to create a piece of geometry to hold the background or the plate where the glass should be. Now I captured this without the glass because it was causing reflection issues and making tracking difficult. So I knew I could add that back in 3D. So let's select our head group by just selecting it and hitting the up key, and hit Control H to hide our head just so we can see these locators here. And let's just jump out to our perspective view and zoom in on these locators. So we want to create a piece of geometry that matches our background, and I like to begin building this based off of our locators. So let's go to our polygon menu, and let's go to Mesh, Create Polygon Tool, and let's hold the V key to turn on vertex or point snapping. Now the first point might not work, but the next point you draw should capture it. For some reason my V key snapping is acting a little strangely. And you can always come up here to your snapping menu to turn snap to points on and off. Once we've drawn out our initial geometry, we can hit the Enter key to create our initial mesh, or our initial polygon face. And now let's jump back into our camera and let's scale this up and move this into position, because remember, we want this to be in the entire, or fill this entire space. So turn off snapping if it's causing you any problems, and that's of course these magnets here in your top bar. Okay, so let's place our initial vertex here, or move it into the right corner or left corner. And now let's just come in and select these vertices, and with the object move axis, let's move these now into place. So you might be saying we could have just created a polygon plane, and that is true, although I prefer using the locators that we exported from MatchMover. Now if you want a little bit, or you want to see this a little bit easier, you can hit the 4 key to move to your wireframe mode, and now we can see our background. So creating this piece of geometry is actually going to have two purposes. One, it's going to let us capture the reflections, but two, it's going to give us a very nice matte for cutting out our image when we get into our compositing application. Now make sure to scrub through your animation, because what might look correct on one frame will look incorrect on a different frame. And that is just the problem of dealing with 3D geometry. Sometimes I have to move these around, especially when we have to deal with many frames of a sequence. So scrub through your animation and make sure that this geometry is stable and correctly placed. And now we can set it up for creating reflections. So I'm just going to select this face here, and let's give it a reflective material. But first I want to place it on a new render layer. So let's go to our Render Layers option, click a new layer, let's call this our reflection, and let's right-click, Add Selected Objects to add our reflective plate, and let's also select our IBL, or our background, and add that to that reflection too. So select your IBL node, right-click, Add to Reflection Layer. Now what we need to do is set up the material for this reflection layer. So let's give this a new MIA Material X. So let's go right click, assign new material, and let's go to our Mental Ray materials, and let's give it a new Material X, and we can give it a Material X Passes because we may be using the passes system later. For now, let's jump over to this new material, which we can call our reflective shader, just so we remember what this is, and let's give it a glass thin replacement. Now what this is going to do is it's going to actually change the color of our reflections and change the color of things that are through it. So instead of that, let's set our index of refraction to 1, which is no refraction, and our color to white, which we can get by turning it black and then turning it all the way white. And one final thing to set up this reflection layer is let's jump into our option box here, and let's turn off Final Gather as a layer override. Now I'm going through these render setup a little quickly because we do cover a lot of this in other courses dedicated to setting up render layers, render passes, and so on and so forth. So let's now right-click, create a layer override, and turn that off because we want it on for our master layer, but we want it off for our reflection. And now let's hit render just to make sure that our reflections are working correctly. So we can see here that we are not getting the reflections we're actually looking for, and our geometry needs to be moved just a little bit here. So let's go back to our mask layer and let's move our geometry out just a little bit. As we saw, our left and right edges were a little bit too far to the left, or our right edge was a little bit too far to the left. So we just need to come in and give that just a little tweak here. And we can, of course, modify this once we jump into our final compositing application. Now you'll notice the camera was showing us the image plane, which we do not want. So let's jump to our image plane here. So I just jumped to our camera, selected it, and now let's jump over to our image plane. And let's just begin by setting the display mode to none, which will hide it from our image. Now if we hit render, we probably still won't see our reflection, but we'll be getting a little bit closer. We now won't see the image behind it. And one last thing we need to do, let's double check our material here. So let's select our object again. And I believe I accidentally said we need to use the glass thin, but let's actually use the glass thick, which will give us the correct material for reflection. So I just hit the render key, and let me just let this render out. Okay, so we can see it here. So now we're actually correctly getting our reflection. And to remove this sort of ground texture appearing in between or with our reflection, we can turn our transparency down to 0. And that's just going to give us the pure reflection without that ground texture. Okay, great. So now we have our reflective layer. And let's also output this as a matte layer. So just going to select this plane here, and let's see, can hit Control-Shift-H. That's Control-Shift-H to bring our head back. And we don't want to see this plane in the master layer, so I'm going to hit Control-H to hide it there. And let me see actually in our reflection, if we hit Control-Shift-H to unhide it, if this has an alpha, which it should, and then we can use this alpha as our cutout. Okay, great. So we're now using this layer sort of for dual purposes as a reflection to capture the environment, as well as a way to get an alpha for the cutout or for our camera. So now let's create a cutout matte in the next lesson based off of this piece of geometry that will only render what we need to be rendered. If I turn back my image plane back on, go back to display mode RGBA, we can see we're rendering out parts of this head, especially at the bottom, that we don't need to. So let's create some geometry to limit that in the next lesson.